there's this story in it's a tidbit of a story, but it's kind of a key plot point or a key plot point. Hinges on this little bit of the story in Esther, where it's in Esther 6, and the king. Ahasuerus, maybe. If a Honduran Texan were pronouncing it, that's how it would be.
There it is.
And anyway, he's having a sleepless night one night, and so he calls some officials in to read some to read him some records, which I'm not sure if he was thinking that'll be the cure for my insomnia, like maybe, right? I don't know, or maybe he was actually wanting to hear some of this, but he says he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, and I guess they had some record of things that had been done in the kingdom that were like awesome, and they came across the story of Mordecai and how he had heard of a plot to kill the king, and he told the king, hey, these two jokers are going to kill you. And he got word to him, and so they found out the plot. It was thwarted and all that. And the king's like, well, did we ever do anything for that guy? And the official's like, no, we didn't. So then he purposes to do something to honor Mordecai for that service, right? And that's like a really common use of this word memorial or remembrance in the Old Testament. It gets translated memorial or remembrance, reminder sometimes. In that case, it's just a book of memorials, a book of remembrances that he's reading. And there's kind of two categories in the Bible on at least from the way I'm looking at it. Two main categories on how this is used, and one is reminding God of us, kind of, right? For example, the priest it's in Exodus when they're getting all the instructions for the tabernacle, right? Really detailed instructions, and also for the priestly garments, very detailed instructions. And one of the things that the priest is supposed to wear is 2 stones on the shoulders, like sewn on there in a pocket or something. I'm not sure. I think it mentions some gold filigrees and some stuff. But these 2 stones of onyx, and he's supposed to, this is in Exodus 28, but also, again, later in Exodus 30-something. If you don't know, Exodus goes in all this detail about all the instructions. And then there's a few chapters of some short stories, and then it repeats the whole thing again about how they did it. Here's what we're supposed to do, and then here's how we did it. And it's almost word for word. It's really, well, there's a point to it. But anyway. So he puts on these stones, and they're supposed to engrave the names of the 12 tribes, 6 on one stone and 6 on the other. He says, get a jeweler to engrave the names. And that way, when the priest comes before me, he'll be bearing the stones as a remembrance. He'll as a remembrance of the tribes up to me. Because the priest is representing the entire nation. The high priest, who's wearing the ephod, is representing the entire nation to God. And so those are symbolic. These are remembrance stones, right? And so that's one side of it, right? There's the Bible mentions memorial offerings. That there's a memorial portion. You bring an offering, but you take a handful of it and you put it on the altar. The rest the priest got, right? Or you take a certain piece of the animal and put it on the altar, and the rest the priest. So it was like the memorial portion is what it's called. It's the part that kind of says, God, remember me, right? In the ancient Jewish culture. And what's interesting is that in Acts, if you could turn to Acts 10, I just want you to see this. This kind of continues a little bit. It's mentioned, but as a There's like a spiritual side to it, you know. I've been talking about physical things, stones, or a part of a sacrifice. But here there's something really interesting that this messenger, this angelic messenger says. So Acts 10, he says, it's the story of Cornelius. Cornelius was this, well, we'll read it here. Verse 1, at Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort, a devout man who feared God with all his household and gave alms generously to the people and prayed continually to God. So he's not an Israelite. He's actually part of the army of the Romans, and he's a centurion, so he's over 100 guys. And the Italian cohort, which I don't know, sounds important, since Italy is where Rome was. But this is in Judea, and so he's a Gentile. But it says that he feared God and his whole household, and he gave alms and he prayed continually. So then, verse 3, about the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, Cornelius. And he stared at him in terror and said, what is it, Lord? So this guy knows his name, but he recognizes something in his appearance that really scares him. He knows this is an angelic being. And so he's normally humans and the divine, when they encounter each other, it can go really bad for the humans sometimes. And so they're usually scared. Plus, it's just like, imagine just seeing, like, who knows what he looked like, but you'd be, like, oh my gosh, right? He's bright, or he's muscular, or he's whatever he was, and he's like, ah. And he says, what is it, Lord? And the messenger says to him, this is in verse 4, your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And then he starts to give him instructions. Now send to Joppa and bring one Simon called Peter. He says, your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And if you don't know the rest of the story, this is the first time. The result of this meeting is they go fetch Peter. Peter goes after the Lord kind of convincing him a little bit. He also had to change his thinking, and it's the first Gentiles to hear the gospel. It's remarkable. It's remarkable that this guy, his prayers and his alms, the angel says, the reason I'm asking you to go get Peter and everything that happens after is because your prayers and your alms have ascended like a memorial. So the images of, just like that sacrifice memorial portion, the smoke, the incense of that has ascended to the throne. But this is a spiritual thing. He's not actually offering sacrifices. He may have gone up to Jerusalem or whatever, but that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about his prayers and his giving to the poor. Those were the things that were compared to this memorial that ascends to God. And God says, yeah, this is the guy. The Holy Spirit first fell on a Gentile at his house, on all the household. First time. And so our acts of faithfulness, of trusting him, of submissive obedience, these things, they get God's attention, which in itself is remarkable, because we're not really known for being that faithful compared to God, are we? But still he sees these things, and Hebrews 11 is dedicated to mentioning that. Like, here's all these people and all the things that they did, and faith, trusting in God, is what causes them to do things that are remembered and noticed by God. He says, yeah, right? Like when God's talking at the beginning of Job, have you noticed my boy Job? Isn't he awesome? Like, have you noticed? He's saying to the angels around, maybe he's saying, did you notice that time that Charlie trusted in me, even though the world around him was saying, giving him every reason not to? Wasn't that awesome? And so that rises up as a memorial. And that's not the objective of the things we do for God, to get him to notice us, right? He's already noticed us. But it is like an effect, a consequence. And then the other one, which we're probably more familiar with, the other way memorials are talked about in the Bible is reminding us of God, right? So go to Joshua 4. You're probably familiar with this story too, but maybe you haven't read it in a while. Joshua 4. Are you there? Okay. Didn't want to leave anybody behind. Verse 1. When all the nation, they're passing through the Jordan into the promised land. When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man. Command them, saying, take 12 stones from here, out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priests' feet stood firmly. So the priests carrying the ark on their shoulders walked out into the middle of the river. And as they began to step out, the waters were parting. And they kept flowing on one side, downstream, and on the other side, they were piled up in a heap. And they walked out to the middle, and they stood there. And then all of Israel passed by, the whole nation, a couple million people probably, right? It was 600,000 fighting men plus women and children. Yeah, it could have been a couple million people. Passed by on this dry riverbed. And so he's saying, take some stones, get 12 guys, one from each tribe, take stones from that place, and then take them with you. This is verse 3. Over and lay them down to the place where you lodge tonight. So the place where you're going to make your camp tonight, take them all the way there. And so Joshua does it. Verse 4 and verse 5, he says, go ahead. And he tells the guys how to do it. And he says in verse 6, this is so that it'll be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, what do these stones mean? They're going to set them up in like a pile where they lodge that night. And he's saying so that in times to come, your kids are going by and say, hey, what's those pile of stones? Because they were obviously set there by people. They were not dropped randomly. So, like, who put them there and why? And so it's so that you should tell them, verse 7, that the waves of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever, a remembrance, a memorial forever. So here the memorial is this monument. In other places, it says in Exodus 12 that the Passover meal is a memorial. So the meal itself is a memorial forever. It also says in Exodus 13, the Feast of Unleavened Bread right after that is a memorial. So that when your kids ask you, hey, why is it this 1 week of the year we don't cook anything with leaven? So that you'll tell them, right? It's a memorial. Why is it that this 1 day of the year we do this ceremony with this Passover lamb? It's a memorial. And so, I mean, the Lord's Supper is one of those things for us, right? It's a memorial. It's a meal, or the symbols of a meal that we have to remember these things. And we need these reminders. We can forget sometimes, you know. I mean, sometimes I don't know if it's happened to you, but there's been times where, with the passage of time, the Lord did something remarkable in your life, but when it's been 15 or 20 or 30 years later, has it lost a little bit of that like excitement and newness and whatever? Does it take you a little more effort to access that in your memories? probably, or maybe it's just me. But when a long time has passed, this can happen. And so these physical reminders of some kind, right? Whether it's a pile of stones or a meal you have, something helps us that when we encounter these new situations, when we need God's faithfulness, when we need God's provision, when we need His guidance, we remember these right? Next time we're facing illness or hardship or uncertainty or we need provision, we remember, man, He did it. If He did it, then He can do it again. It's like a watermark. This is how faithful He's been in the past. And those watermarks are there for a reason. If the river ever flooded that high in the past, it could do so again. If living in the Mississippi Delta has taught us has taught those folks anything, or the Nile, or any of these places that flood every few hundred years, right? So, like Mike said, we were asking for us to bring a word, and the word is a representation of the story, right? Something that reminds you of a story or a series of stories in your life. This is what God did. This is what God did, and this is where He met me, and just to memorialize, what He's done for us here. It's not a sad time. I mean, I'm going to miss some things about this building. It's sure, yeah. But what I mean is, we're not saying, oh man, those times are past and they're not coming again. We're saying, let's remember what He's done, because He can do it again, and He's going to do it again. And we're not getting, like we've talked about before, we're not getting kicked out of this building. God is leading us out of this building to a new place.